All right, so next we're going to look at some failover and set up basic failover configuration on the devices. For the scope of the lab, failover, again, would most likely just be another section. Make sure that you do read through your entire lab ahead of time. Reading through can tell you what other items you may configure. First section could say configure ASA1 for this. Second section could say configure ASA2 for this. And a third or fourth section later on could say configure ASA1 to back up ASA2, vice versa, in which case it would affect your configuration of the devices. It would mean both failover configuration and getting into a context configuration as well. Starting off, different failover types, general failover information on the device itself. So different types of failover we have, active standby or active-active. Active standby, having one device actively passing the traffic and having a second device that's just standby, waiting if the first device fails, then able to take over. So different types of failover. Again, we had a little bit earlier, we talked about the interface, the redundant interfaces, being able to have single interface failover. A certain interface fails, I can use a redundant interface to fail over to a second one. With full box failover, I can fail over to a completely separate ASA. So active-active, slightly different. With active-active, both units forwarding traffic, in this case requiring multiple context mode. We talked about the ability to have, say, context. You can have, say, 4 interfaces, have them split up, 2 in context A, 2 in context B, have 2 firewalls side by side. I can say that I want firewall 1 to be the primary for context A, and that I want firewall 2 to be the primary for context B, and have either one of those be able to take over if the other one fails. So slightly different. Because of that, requiring multiple context mode, talk a little bit more about some of the limitations, some of the features that are not available. With active standby, what we're going to look at first, active standby, being able to still do routed mode and still have the full functionality of the device. Different types of failover itself can be stateless failover or stateful failover. So stateless failover, not maintaining state information between devices from one ASA to another. Stateful, replicating that state table information. So existing connection information, existing items that he's aware of, existing items that are passing through, having that replicated through. From a traffic standpoint, if you're just doing the replication of your configuration, generally not a whole lot of traffic there. If you have a high number of connections and you're replicating every single connection that comes through, every web connection coming through to a web server, every DNS entry going through, waiting for a response, your traffic for state information can be very high because you can have thousands of connections a second on these boxes. The state information itself can take a bit of bandwidth on those items. As far as general configuration, starting off with active standby, generally additional recommendations are to be very careful. Save a copy of your active configuration. General basic in theory operation is that when there's a transition, the active becomes standby, the standby becomes active, assuming the MAC address, IP address information for the other unit. As far as saving your configuration first, if you're not careful in the configuration, I have seen a number of people configure things slightly off and end up pushing a blank configuration from the secondary device to the primary device. So for that reason, strongly recommended to save the configuration, save off copy. Again, you do have Notepad available for the exam. So make sure that you're careful if you do accidentally overwrite, push from a secondary to a primary, where your secondary has a blank or new blank configuration, then could potentially have issues. Just a second here. And it looks like this one didn't get uploaded, so we're going to get this uploaded here really quick. Just one moment. And for those of you following along, this is a separate PDF on the ASA Part 2 with the additional failover information. General configuration for failover setup. So we have addresses configured, basic failover commands. We can go through these a little bit in just a moment. Starting off with the address themselves. On my regular device, on my regular interfaces themselves, I have my addresses configured. I also have an option at the end of that command for a standby address. In this case, the standby address would be the address of the secondary unit. In this case, if my primary was the .12, I could put in a secondary address of the, say, .13. And with that secondary address in there, then if I was on that network and I wanted to ping the standby device, if he was up and alive, I could ping that .13 address and getting a response back. That would be the standby device. Now, in this case, it's not always the device that was originally secondary. If I did have a failover between my primary and my secondary, my device that was primary is now in standby, and he would then be listening on that IP address. So the standby IP is an address on the device that the non-active device would be answering on. Additional failover options and failover configuration. Designating my primary unit. So my device is going to be designated either primary or secondary. In this case, the example looking at my primary device configuration, failover LAN unit primary. Beyond that, I have specifying a failover interface, being a separate interface that I'm using for failover information. The command for this failover LAN interface. Beyond that, I have an interface name that I'm using. And then for that interface, assigning an IP address. So slightly different. If I have an interface, say Ethernet 02 being used, I have that failover LAN interface with the name Ethernet 02, and then that being assigned an address not under the Ethernet 02, but using the failover interface IP command. Again, you do also have the option here for the standby address. Again, the standby address would be the address that would be responded to by the non-active firewall. In the event you're doing stateful failover, mentioned that your failover could be stateful or it could be stateless. If you're doing stateless failover, then you're just pushing configuration information. Any existing connections would need to be reestablished, whereas new connections would still be able to just pass through. So if you're doing stateful, you also need to have an interface specified for that state information. In this case, that's done with the failover link. Two commands very close. We have the failover LAN, specify the failover interface, and here we also have the failover link. Failover link being where the state information is passed. And we're going to pull up some configuration examples here as well. Beyond that, we have the interface policy, monitor interface command. So the monitor interface command will tell you that you want to monitor an interface. In this case, if I have an interface or subinterface, monitor interface will be used to specify that. Some interfaces are going to be monitored by default, others are not. One example would be a situation like a subinterface. A subinterface not being monitored by default. If you want to monitor a subinterface, you would need to go into configuration monitor interface for that subinterface. And we'll look at that in the display output of our failover. You also have the option for interface policy as far as what you want your thresholds to be. Do you want your threshold to be that as soon as one interface fails, that things fail over? Do you want to have some other threshold or number percentage of interfaces that will actually trigger failover from the active to standby? And finally, we have the failover command by itself without anything else will actually enable failover. From a configuration perspective, generally recommended to put that command in last, because as soon as you put that command in, he's going to actively try and start failover. So generally better to define all your failover parameters and then do the failover command by itself last, so that he would then initiate when he has all the information configured. Now, additional information. In this case, let's say the primary config. We also have the configuration on the secondary device. So on the secondary device, failover LAN interface, again specifying that LAN interface where he's getting the configuration from with the IP address for that failover interface. Unit defined as primary, in this case being defined as secondary because he's a standby unit. If you are doing stateful, you can also add in the failover link command. However, that is not mandatory, as the failover link command would get pushed from the primary when the configuration gets replicated. And finally, enabling failover with the failover command by itself. Those are the general steps being used. With those general steps, able to have the failover successfully take place. Now we're going to go ahead and pull up the configuration itself. We did talk about having access to the configuration guides themselves in the lab. In this case, looking at the security appliance configuration guide, there is a reference section that does include sample configurations of the devices. It has a variety of different general common setups, basic setups, single context, multiple context, different security levels, options, different context examples. So you do have access to basic examples in the lab in case you're just forgetting something and want to quickly find an example. There are some good examples on the ASA as far as general setup. Looking through some of these, just general different types of things that can be done. Again, some of these doing things like redundant interfaces. So different things like that being used as common features throughout here. Context we'll talk about in a little bit here as well. We're going to get through to our failover, look at some of the failover examples we have here. That example 9 was our failover. I'm just going to scroll down to that one. Again, be familiar with the examples you do have access to in the documentation. In this case, showing a failover configuration on the devices, we have a primary unit configured as well as a secondary unit. We have inside and outside interfaces. In this case, we also have two interfaces, one for the failover information, one for the state information. So different interfaces set up there. So I have failover and state using two separate interfaces. Now those can use the same interface, in this example using two separate interfaces. So scrolling through our configuration, looking for our failover commands. We have a failover section here. All our commands there that start with failover. And it does reorder those. That's not necessarily the order they were put in. We have the failover by itself, as we mentioned, to initiate failover, turn failover on. Just because you have the other failover commands configured doesn't mean failover is on. You need to have the failover command by itself have failover on. So failover, LAN unit primary, this is my primary device. I have my LAN interface failover, that's where my replication information is. Failover is my name for my replication for my configuration interface. And in this case, that's specified as gigabit 02. Failover LAN enable, not required on the ASA, just separate command on the PICs, as it says in a little note below that. Full time, key information, failover key, failover link state, in this case, failover LAN interface, and failover link. So failover LAN and failover link, in case this one called state, gigabit 0/3. And we have addresses for those two, addresses for the failover, addresses for the state interface, as well as standby, which would be an address that the secondary would respond on. Looking at the secondary configuration, the secondary device does not have a lot of configuration. Other than having the failover itself, all the secondary really needs is basic information to connect to the primary. In this case, having the address information for the failover interface, what interface is specified as a failover interface, that he's a secondary, possibly a key, and the failover command by itself. We're going to pull this document to the side, bring up our devices here. Now during the break, we did change the VLANs on the switch to make sure that my ASA1, ASA2 have the same VLANs for the respective ports. In this case, just going to go ahead and set up that configuration on ASA1. Set up failover LAN interface at 0/2. Now, when you do this, it will give you an informational message that it has cleared out any non-failover interface config on that device. So be very careful when typing that in. If you had a different interface, you could have just cleared that out. Again, generally recommended to take a copy of your configuration before getting into failover configuration in case something goes wrong. So beyond that, we're going to have failover addressing specified. We've got our failover LAN interface specified. We've got our addressing specified for that. Specified as primary. And failover by itself to enable failover. Grab that configuration there. Now, as mentioned, look at your information, look at your configuration, make sure that you are checking through things, look at what your output shows. In this case, looking at the output of show failover. And what do we see? We have interfaces here showing waiting and also showing not monitored. Also showing no response from mate. So looking at our options here, as mentioned, we have the monitor interface command. We can look at our options for that. In this case, DMZ inside and outside. We're going to go ahead and add on DMZ and inside. And we're going to look at the output of our show failover again. Okay. So now looking at our information here, up here we were not monitored, no link, and now we're showing as normal and waiting. Next, we're going to set up our configuration on ASA2. Now, ASA2, we did have the configuration cleared out, so we went ahead and just erased it. So starting from a blank configuration here. Again, show mode and show failover. Sorry, show mode and show firewall. Make sure that your modes do match up. If you have one device single mode, one device multiple context mode, or one device in a routed mode, the other device in a transparent firewall mode, a mismatch will prevent failover from working properly, won't let you to replicate from someone who has a different mode. We're going to set up our basic configuration. Again, looking at the information we had configured on the other side. Specify our failover LAN information. Again, clearing out our non-failover config there and specifying our address information. Again, can just copy and paste for that one. The advantages of using Notepad. Anything else you need to do here? Figured our failover interface. Set up our addressing. More commands we need. Okay, so in this case, we need to start off by adding in this device as a secondary. We're going to need to have failover by itself. Failover on. We also still need, going back to what we said earlier, make sure our interface is not shut down. Double check our switch configuration here for these two devices. and Ethernet 02 on FA013 for ASA1 in VLAN 1000, Ethernet 02 on FA015 in VLAN 1000. So VLAN brief. Verifying those are both showing in that VLAN. In this case, those are both showing in VLAN 1000. It is possible it just was the spanning tree items there. This does show us up. In case we admin down on ASA1, which could cause problems. So it said there, beginning configuration replication, setting to mate, end configuration replication to mate. Just show failover. Showing we do have information about the primary and secondary. This host primary active, other host secondary standby. In this case, currently we do not have stateful configured. In this case, just stateless configuration configured for failover. If we wanted to, we could go ahead and configure that, go ahead and add that in. Again, the command syntax is very similar, it's slightly different under the failover commands. Looking at our options, are these two very similar? We have failover LAN and we have failover link. Failover LAN used for failover communication, as shown here. Failover link used for state information, for state updates. Now, there's a couple different ways that this can be done. You can use two separate physical interfaces. You could potentially do it as two different sub-interfaces, or you could potentially use the same interface for both. And slightly different on the configuration side for that. And again, keep in mind that you do have configuration examples in your documentation. So looking at the earlier example that we saw, primary unit configuration, having some failover config, failover link interface named state, failover LAN interface named failover, and in this case we had two separate items, failover and state, as two separate physical interfaces connecting between the device. Now in our next example here in the documentation, it's shown using a single physical interface. In this case, a single physical interface for the failover link and for the state link. Looking at the configuration example there, the difference for that, if you're using the same physical interface for both, is having the name be the same. So here we have the failover LAN as FO link named the same as the failover link of FO link. So in this case, we set our other one as fail. So we're going to go ahead and set up failover link and fail. And we said ETH 0/2. Take a look at our show failover. We now show that we do have failover link configured. We do also show traffic statistics for that particular link. different items coming up there. Now we switched over to ASA2, looking through the configuration here, verifying we do see everything. We do see failover LAN interface, failover link as well. One other thing you may notice, our host name does say ASA1. The configuration replication does include host name. So don't think that you're on ASA1, you're actually on ASA2, but because he has a configuration replication from the other side, that host name comes with that. Now, if you try and configure on your non-active device, fortunately you will get a warning message. Basically tells you if you configure on this device, your configurations are not going to be synchronized. So be aware that you do need to be on the active unit when you're doing configuration. Again, take a look at the show failover. Show failover information, looking at available information, showing information, who's active, who's standby. Now we had the addresses as well as the standby here. So in this case, on the interfaces themselves, we show address of 0.0.0.0. Under our failover configuration that we had, going back up a little bit here, on our failover options, we had a standby address specified. We can also specify a standby address on the physical interface addresses themselves as well. So that standby could be in different locations. So in this case, if on this interface here, we're going to go ahead and just adjust that. I'm going to grab this and copy and paste it. And I want to make sure that I'm on the other device. Now I've configured a standby address on my Ethernet 0. I'm going to go ahead and save my configuration. Do a show failover. In this case, I now show that address there. That address, my own address, and from router 2, should be able to ping both those addresses. And a little bit of ARP there. Router 2 able to ping both those addresses. Another question came up about using the prompt command. In addition to hostname, you do also have an option with the prompt command. Those of you that are not familiar, you can have it show you what various information you have. If you had multiple contacts, what context you're in. You can also get into things like showing the priority information. So looking at the existing configuration, my current prompt is hostname context. I'm going to go ahead and change that and say prompt hostname context, and we'll say priority. Now this does show as primary. If I switch to ASA2, it shows as secondary. So different types of things you can do if you'd like to, depending on what you feel comfortable with. For the scope of doing something like that for the lab exam, you may want to ask the proctor if it's okay to change your prompt to show the other information, or you may just put it in and then just remove it at the end of the day. So different possibilities, different options that you have there. Any other general questions on failover configuration on the devices? One thing I will emphasize, make sure you are comfortable with configuring things like context and failover. For the most part, it seems that those still seem to be areas that a lot of people have difficulty with when it comes to lab exam just because of not using those on a regular basis. So make sure that you are familiar with those, are familiar with configuring those items and getting those set up, as well as being able to troubleshoot those. Again, start with basic things. A lot of people I've seen that get very deep into configuration only to realize after trying to fight and troubleshoot something that they had a interface that was shut down. This was causing trouble along the way. So make sure that you do start with those. And for the most part, getting into state things should fail over properly. I have seen some cases with things like VPNs where they don't necessarily always fail over cleanly. If you are doing things like VPNs on the box as well, in the midst of configuring things, I've seen situations where you get an error message that's something like it won't start up because he's not the active person, but he is the active person. Generally, any issues like that for the scope of the lab are cleared up with a reload of both devices. Other things to be aware of with reloading on the ASA, be aware that a reload on a router generally will, in some cases, fix things. On the ASA, if you are on ASA 1 and I reload ASA 1, what's going to happen? Well, if I've got failover configured, I'm going to fail over to ASA 2. If I failed over to ASA 2, I could have the same issue, I could have some other issue. If, for example, I had ASA2 didn't have its interfaces in the proper VLAN, I may have completely different problems that I was seeing before that I was trying to troubleshoot. So if you are doing failover, generally recommend that you reboot both devices for the scope of the lab, reload both devices, make sure that the device that was active before is still active, or alternatively, if you think it is just because something is on one device, you can try changing it from active to secondary and see if the problem clears up. Again, look at individual items on your switches themselves, verify your switch configuration. Start small, start with your basic connectivity. In this case, say router 2 being adjacent to the ASA there. If I didn't have something configured properly, I should check first off, can I get to router 2? Can I ping router 2 rather than trying to establish, say, a LAN-to-LAN VPN or remote access VPN that's going clear to some other point in the topology. Again, be familiar with information on your devices themselves. As mentioned, we do have the sample configurations available. Again, scroll through those, be familiar with those in the documentation, where those are, have the general gist of things, make sure you have worked through things in advance. In this case, some things like failover context, people get a little confused when different commands end up shuffling to different places. We will talk a little bit about context as well. Context you can also get into. Here's an example here. We'll just scroll down a little bit too. So getting into that same example, the second one you're looking at, having the failover LAN, failover link specified, in this case dealing with context. Now in this case also with context, getting into the active-active type of configuration. Now with the active-active configuration, having one device active for some contexts and another device active for other contexts. So in this case, we have that being done with failover groups. So we have failover group 1 and failover group 2. The individual contexts themselves assigned to those failover groups. So here we see we have failover group defined, primary, secondary, information with those. Then within the context itself, we have a failover group joined. So in this case, context admin is joining group 1. Context named CTX1 is joining failover group 2. When dealing with things like failover groups, conceptually it's not that hard to understand. From a configuration perspective, you've got a number of lines there. Other things to be aware of in a situation like that, with failover groups, if you try to configure failover groups, it won't take the syntax while failover is enabled. If I just pull over to this device and I try and just type in failover group 1, I should get an error message. Text slightly off there. That does require multiple context modes, so I can't quite pull that one up right now. But that would require just doing a no failover, configure your failover groups, and join those, and then turn failover back on. Again, be careful when you are configuring the failover and getting the failover information set up. As far as the current status, in this case, ASA1 was primary. If I switch back to ASA2, and manually switch over with the failover active. So failover active, switching this device over to active mode. All right, so we talked a little bit about context earlier. A little bit more discussion here. Contexts themselves being able to take the firewall splitting up into logical groupings, logical individual virtual firewalls called contexts. So having one physical device split up into separate logical subunits. So with that, for those of you familiar with the VRF features or functionality on routers or switches, somewhat similar, behaving as multiple devices, devices having independent route information, and things like that. So with a single physical box, able to have multiple logical items, multiple logical devices, boxes configured. Some slight differences on that. One of those being things like routing protocols, VPNs, not supported. So some restrictions as far as what is and what is not supported on the device itself. In this case, VPNs not supported, routing protocols to the device not supported. So if I don't have routing protocols supported, what do I need to do to pass traffic? I need to still have some information. In this case, without routing protocols, would leave me with having static routes configured. So may need to have multiple static routes, different static routes in each individual context. They may not have necessarily the same routing policy. They could have static routes in different directions. You can get into situations of shared interfaces as well. For the most part, usually we'll have separate interfaces, but you can have shared interfaces. So starting off, basic modes. Again, one of the things mentioned when you're first starting off, check your devices, show firewall, show mode. Are you in firewall routed mode or transparent mode? Routed mode acting as a layer 3 hop. Transparent mode as a bump in the wire, same logical subnet. In this case, contexts themselves mode single or mode multiple. So mode multiple reboots device and blank config. So changing the device information over. So taking the existing items, changing that around. So because it does clear out your device and can clear out your config, that can cause problems. So be aware that that sort of thing can happen. Make sure you are on the proper device. I have seen people get all finished configuring one device, have it all done, and thought they switched to the second device when they were really still on the first device, and did a change in their mode, and it cleared out their configuration, and they had to start over. So be very careful with anything that's going to clear out your configuration. Make sure you are on the proper device. General items, you have the system context as well as the admin context. So converting from a single mode to multiple, you have a default of the admin context. From the admin context, you can connect to the other context. The system context being the general underlying control of what interfaces are in what contexts. Changing from one to another is done with the change to keyword, and we'll get to that in just a little bit here. So general information. Configuring items. Configure the interfaces, define your context. Context, give it a name. Tell it where he's storing his config information. In this case, having a config URL stored in Flash usually. Beyond that, having interfaces allocated to the context itself. And we'll come back to looking at some examples here in just a minute. So you go through basic setup, have the config information specified, interfaces allocated. Again, mention that contexts are done differently. Because it's a context, you're removing things logically from the main interfaces and putting them into the context. So things like your IP addresses are now configured under the context, not under the main interface itself. So within the context, the interface in the context, that would be where those items are configured. Other additional contexts, you can get into having additional contexts. As mentioned earlier, you can get into having a interface between them that is shared. So in the event you do have an interface that's shared between two contexts, you do need to have some sort of distinction so that the ASA knows which context that traffic is destined for. So in this case, if I have context A and context B, and they're sharing a physical outside interface, I need to know how to get traffic coming in. Is it going to context A or context B? Some of the different ways that can be done with unique MAC addresses. having MAC addresses specified for the individual contacts can be done with different NAT mappings or different networks behind the devices. Different possibilities, different options there. If there is a management connection, if I have two contacts, context A and context B, and then I go ahead and configure some other features, SSH or Telnet or other management access, that device, SSHing to that device is only going to access that particular context. They're not going to be able to access the other context. So looking at a context example here, we are going to add in another interface here on our ASA1, and I'm going to configure a context for a connection there to switch to, and a separate connection for the other side talking to router 5. And before we do that, we're going to go ahead and take a short break, and then we'll come back and jump into some context configuration.